All right, let's go. Number 10, the black drink. In 2012, Patricia Crown of the University of New Mexico published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with Thomas Emerson of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey and W. Jeffrey Hurst, a chemist who had spent most of his career analyzing cacao. They had taken pottery beakers out of museum storage, drilled samples from the inside walls, and run the powder through a mass spectrometer. The beakers came from Cahokia and the settlements around it. Cahokia stood on the Mississippi floodplain opposite what is now St. Louis, and around AD 1100 it was the largest city anywhere north of Mexico. Its central mound covers more ground at the base than the Great Pyramid. The vessels are odd little things: cylindrical, single serving, a handle on one side, and a small pouring lip on the other, incised with motifs tied to water and the underworld. They appear at Cahokia and radiate outward across the Midwest, and for decades, nobody could say what went into them. The residue said it. 3 compounds came out together: caffeine, theobromine, and ursolic acid in proportions that fit one plant. Ilex vomitoria, the yaupon holly. It is the only plant native to what is now the United States that produces caffeine in any quantity. The vessels date from roughly AD 1050 to 1250, which pushes the drink back at least 5 centuries before any European wrote a word about it. What makes this more than a chemistry result is a map. Yaupon does not grow at Cahokia. It does not grow anywhere close. Its natural range clings to the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, hundreds of miles to the south, and there is no evidence anybody was cultivating it in the interior. Every leaf in those cups was carried north by hand, up the river systems, across a distance that takes weeks to cover on foot. People were importing a stimulant into the middle of the continent 1,000 years ago, in quantity, and making special cups to serve it in. The written accounts arrive much later, and all of them are outsiders looking in. French and Spanish observers on the Florida coast in the 1560s described a dark, hot infusion served to men seated in ranked order at council. Jacques Lemoyne's drawings, engraved and circulated by Theodore de Bry, show the drink being handed round while a war party is discussed. 2 centuries later, the naturalist William Bartram traveled through Creek and Cherokee towns and found the same practice running, and he was clear about the occasions. The drink belonged to council, to ceremony, and to men preparing to go out and fight. The reported effects need care because the observers were confused, hostile, or both. The chemistry underneath does not. Roasted and boiled the way it was prepared, yaupon delivers a serious dose of caffeine, and the men drinking it were often fasting when they took it. Then there is the name, which is one of the strangest small injuries in the history of botany, and an extraordinary demonstration of what a single Latin word can do to a plant. In 1789, the English botanist William Ayton catalogued the plant and called it Ilex vomitoria because Europeans had watched men vomit during the ceremonies. Modern chemical analysis has found no emetic compound in the leaf at all. The vomiting almost certainly came from the fasting, from the quantity, from the temperature, and from what the ritual required, and in some accounts from other plants added to the pot. The name held anyway. The only caffeine plant on the continent now carries a warning in its own Latin. North America imports its stimulants from 3 other continents, and the holly grows wild and unwanted across the southeast, where it has always been. Number 9. The wine left in an empty camp. Toward the end of the 1st century AD, a Roman senator and former governor of Britain named Sextus Julius Frontinus compiled a handbook of military tricks. He called it the Stratagemata. It is an entirely practical book, sorted by problem, and in the second book, in the chapter on ambushes, he records the following. A Carthaginian commander named Maharbal was sent against rebellious Africans. He knew that the people he was fighting were fond of wine, so he took a large quantity of it and mixed in mandragora, mandrake, which in Frontinus's own phrase has a strength somewhere between a poison and a sleeping draught. He fought a deliberately unimpressive skirmish and pulled back. In the middle of the night, he abandoned the camp, leaving behind part of the baggage and all of the drugged wine, and made the withdrawal look like flight. The enemy took the camp, found the wine, and drank it. Maharbal came back. Frontinus finishes without a flicker of drama. He either took them prisoner or killed them where they lay, stretched out as though dead. That is the entire account. A few lines of Latin filed under ambushes. Frontinus was not writing entertainment. He had commanded armies in Britain and later ran the water supply of Rome, and the Stratagemata was assembled as a working reference for officers who might need the same solution to the same problem. The plant is real, and the pharmacology is not in dispute. Mandrake is a nightshade, a flat rosette of leaves over a thick forked root, and it carries tropane alkaloids, hyoscyamine and scopolamine and atropine, at up to a few percent of dry weight. These are the compounds that shut down the parasympathetic nervous system. In small amounts, they dry the mouth, widen the pupils, and drive up the heart rate. In larger amounts, they produce agitation, delirium, and hallucinations. The person cannot separate from the room, followed by a heavy, immovable sleep. Beyond that, the sleep does not end. Ancient physicians knew the dose precisely. Dioscorides, writing in the same century as Frontinus, prescribes mandrake in wine to people facing surgery, and describes patients becoming unaware of the pain because they sink into a deep sleep. He also states the quantity that kills, and Pliny, writing in the same generation, gives the same measure. The drug in Maharbal's abandoned wine was in that same century a surgical anesthetic. Except that Frontinus is not the only writer who tells this story. 2 generations later, a Macedonian named Polyaenus assembled his own collection of stratagems and dedicated it to Marcus Aurelius. He tells it again, the same trick, the same drugged wine left behind, the same feigned retreat, the same enemy, whom he also simply calls Africans, and the same collapse into sleep. But the commander is not Maharbal. In Polyaenus, the man who does it is named Himilco. 2 authors, 2 names, 1 story. Neither gives a year, neither gives a place, neither names one of the men who drank. That is what these collections are. Frontinus and Polyaenus were both mining earlier Greek handbooks that no longer exist, and inside that literature, a good trick travels the way. A joke travels through a barracks, picking up a new commander with every retelling. What survives is not an event. It is a procedure, cut loose from whoever first used it, kept because it worked often enough to be worth writing down. And the procedure is almost insultingly simple. It does not require a battle, or numbers, or ground. It requires knowing what the other side likes to drink, and being willing to leave a great deal of good wine behind in a camp that will probably be looted before dawn. The wine is gone. The camp cannot be located on any map. The 2 names cancel each other out. What is left is a plant still growing across the Mediterranean, a set of alkaloids anesthetists still keep within reach, and 1 paragraph in a Roman manual recording the moment somebody worked out that an army can be beaten by its own thirst. Number 8. The bag made of 3 fox snouts. The bag is made from the snouts of 3 foxes, skinned and sewn together with the fur still on, and the muzzles turned outward. It is about the size of a large purse. It came out of a dry rock shelter called Cueva del Chileno in the Lipez highlands of southwestern Bolivia, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, wrapped inside a leather bundle with everything else its owner needed. Radiocarbon puts the bundle at roughly 1,000 years old, in the centuries when the Tiwanaku state dominated the southern Andes. The kit is complete. 2 carved wooden tablets for holding powder, a tube for inhaling it, bound with braided human hair, spatulas cut from llama bone, a woven headband, dried plant material. Somebody assembled all of it, wrapped it, and left it in a cave. And the altiplano is dry enough and cold enough that it simply stayed there. In 2019, a team led by Melanie Miller of the University of California, Berkeley, working with Jose Capriles of Penn State and Juan Albarracin Jordan in La Paz, published the chemistry in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They scraped a small sample from inside the fox snout bag and ran it through liquid chromatography and tandem mass spectrometry. 5 compounds came back: cocaine and benzoylecgonine, its breakdown product, which together mean coca leaf; bufotenine, which points to the seeds of Anadenanthera, the tree known in the Andes as vilca; dimethyltryptamine; and harmine. That last pair is what stopped people. Dimethyltryptamine is not active by mouth on its own, because an enzyme in the gut destroys it before it reaches the blood. Harmine inhibits that enzyme. Put the two together, and the compound survives digestion. That combination is the pharmacological engine of ayahuasca. And there it was, inside a bag, 1,000 years ago, on a plateau 4 kilometers above the forest where those plants grow. But here's where the bag stops being a curiosity and turns into a logistics problem. Not one of these plants grows where the bundle was found. Coca comes from the wet eastern slopes. Anadenanthera grows lower and hotter still. The vine and the leaf behind harmine and dimethyltryptamine belong to the Amazon basin, hundreds of kilometers away and thousands of meters down. One person, or one line of practitioners, was assembling a pharmacy out of at least 3 ecological zones and carrying it up onto ground where none of it will survive a night. The authors are careful about the ayahuasca comparison, and the caution is worth repeating. Finding those compounds in one container does not prove they were ever combined in a single preparation. What it proves is that one practitioner had all of them at once in the same bag. The wider Andean record shows how deep the practice runs. Snuff tubes carrying traces of these alkaloids have been recovered in northern Argentina from contexts around 4,000 years old. In the oases of San Pedro de Atacama, in northern Chile, hundreds of carved wooden snuff trays have come out of the graves, and Constantino Manuel Torres spent decades cataloging them and showing how their imagery tracks the reach of Tiwanaku. That is the disturbing part of it, and it has nothing to do with visions. These substances moved with states. In 2022, Matthew Bywer and colleagues published a study of Quilcapampa, a Wari settlement in southern Peru, where vilca seeds turned up alongside the residues of mole beer. Their reading is that the Wari elite combined the two and served them at feasts, converting something an individual could once do alone into something available only to people who were invited. Neither Wari nor Tiwanaku expanded gently. Both left fortifications, weapons, and severed heads treated as trophies. The fox snouts are still sewn together. The tube still carries its braid of human hair. What cannot be recovered is the arrangement those objects sat inside. Who was handed the powder? Who was refused it? And what was owed afterward? We have the chemistry of 5 plants and the equipment to deliver all of them, and no way of knowing whether the owner of this bag was healing people or holding them. Number 7. The drink the war god drank. The oldest surviving religious literature in any Indo-European language spends an extraordinary amount of its length on a beverage. The Rig Veda, composed in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent during the 2nd millennium BC, runs to more than 1,000 hymns, and one entire book of it, the 9th, is given over to a single substance called soma. The hymns describe it being pressed between stones, strained through a fleece of wool mixed with milk, and drunk. They call it tawny. They call it the drop, and they are unusually specific about who drinks it. Indra drinks it. Indra is the war god, and the central act of the Rig Veda is Indra killing the serpent Vritra and releasing the waters, and he takes soma before he does it. The hymns say so plainly. The war bands who sang those hymns drank it as well. The same substance surfaces on the Iranian side of the linguistic split, in the Avesta, under a name that is the identical word run through a regular sound change, Hauma. And it is not only a text. Zoroastrian priests still press a plant for the Haoma ceremony, and the plant they press is ephedra. Ephedra is a scrubby, jointed, nearly leafless shrub that grows across the dry belt from the Mediterranean to Mongolia. Chinese medicine has used it for a very long time under the name mahuang. Its active compounds are ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. The pharmacology explains the interest. Ephedrine acts on both alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, which is to say, it does chemically what adrenaline does in the body. It lifts blood pressure. It raises heart rate. It opens the airway. It pushes back fatigue and suppresses appetite. It is, in the most literal sense the language allows, a plant that manufactures the fight or flight response. That is a fair description of what any commander would want in his men before a fight. Ephedra is also physically present in the archaeology of the region these people came from. Bundles of ephedra twigs have been lifted from Bronze Age burials in the Tarim Basin at cemeteries like Xiaohe, laid in beside the dead in graves so dry that the stems survive in recognizable pieces. What makes this an open question rather than a solved one is the vessel evidence, and the vessel evidence does not hold. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi excavated a group of monumental sites in the Karakum Desert of Turkmenistan. Gonur-Depe and Togolok, 21 among them, belonging to the culture now called the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. He identified rooms he read as sanctuaries, fitted with vessels and strainers, and reported traces of ephedra, poppy, and cannabis inside them. He argued he had found the place where haoma was made. Those identifications did not survive re-examination. Later analysis of the same material, including work by the Dutch archaeobotanist Corey Bakels, found millet and no ephedra. The rooms are real and the strainers are real. The residues that made them famous are not established. So the physical proof is missing, and the proposals have been stacking up for 2.5 centuries. In 1968, the banker and amateur mycologist Gordon Wasson argued that soma was the fly agaric mushroom. In 1989, David Flattery and Martin Schwartz argued for Syrian rue. Others have put forward cannabis, blue lotus, and various combinations of all of them. Ephedra holds the strongest position. Because of the living Zoroastrian practice, and because the descriptions read like a stimulant rather than a hallucinogen, it is still not proven, and the later Indian ritual texts already prescribe substitute plants for soma, which means the original identity was slipping away while the ceremony was still being performed. The molecule, though, kept going, and this is where the entry stops being ancient. In 1885, the Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayoshi crystallized ephedrine out of mahuang. In 1924, at Peking Union Medical College, Chen Kuei and Carl Schmidt established what it did in the body and pushed it into Western medicine as a treatment for asthma. Ephedrine worked, but the supply chain was awkward and the effects were brief, so pharmacologists went hunting for a synthetic substitute. In 1929, an American chemist named Gordon Alls tested one of the candidates on himself and recorded a feeling of well-being and a mind that would not stop running. The compound was amphetamine. It reached armies inside a decade. Amphetamine went into Allied aircrew as benzedrine. Methamphetamine went into German troops as Pervitin, distributed in tens of millions of tablets in the spring and early summer of 1940. The plant the war god drank has never been identified with certainty. Its leading candidate was isolated, purified, improved on, and then issued by the crate to soldiers 3,500 years later. Number 6. The Scythian tent. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus described what the Scythians did after a burial. He says the mourners cleaned themselves. They set 3 poles, leaning together, stretched felt over the frame until it was as tight as they could pull it, and set a dish of red-hot stones inside. Then, they took the seed of a plant he calls cannabis, threw it onto the stones, and climbed in. The seed smoked. Herodotus writes that the Scythians howled with pleasure, and that this served them in place of a bath. For 2,500 years, that passage was filed under the things Herodotus was assumed to have invented. Then, Sergei Rudenko started digging in the Altai. The Pazyryk kurgans are the burial mounds of Scythian-related horse nomads, and they have one peculiar property. Water seeped down into the chambers, froze, and never fully thawed again. Rudenko excavated there in 1929, and again from 1947. And what came out of that ice was organic material that has no business existing. Knotted carpets, felt hangings, wooden furniture, whole horses with their bridles still on, tattooed human skin. And in the second barrow, a small six-pole frame, felt covers, and a censer holding stones and burnt hemp seeds. Herodotus had described the apparatus correctly, component by component, from a report about a people he had never visited. That is one of the cleanest confirmations of an ancient ethnographic account anywhere in archaeology. And it took a lens of ice in Siberia to deliver it. The tent is only the beginning of the record. In 2008, a team led by the neurologist and cannabis researcher Ethan Russo published an analysis of material from tomb M90 at the Yanghai Cemetery near Turpan, in Xinjiang, a grave about 2,700 years old. It held a man buried with a bridle, archery equipment, and a harp. Beside him, in a wooden bowl in a leather basket, were 789 grams of cannabis. Not fiber, not cordage. Flowering material with the large stems removed, which is what selecting for potency physically looks like. Chromatography confirmed that the plant had carried tetrahydrocannabinol. In 2019, Meng Ren, Yimin Yang, Robert Spengler, and Nicole Boivin published the strongest result in the sequence in Science Advances. At the Jirzunkel Cemetery on the Pamir Plateau, more than 3,000 meters up, excavators had recovered 10 wooden braziers from 8 tombs, each still holding burnt stones. Gas chromatography found cannabinol on 9 of the 10, on the interior surfaces only, which is what controlled burning inside the vessel looks like, and what accidental contamination does not. Cannabinol is what tetrahydrocannabinol degrades into over time. Its presence without the balancing signature of the non-psychoactive compound points to plants markedly stronger than the wild cannabis of that region. Somebody was choosing. Angular harps were buried in the same tombs. The truly unsettling thing about the sequence is not any single site. It is the spread. In 2020, Aaron Ari, Baruch Rosen, and Dvory Namdar published residue analysis from the shrine at Tel Arad in the Negev, dated to roughly 750 to 715 BC. 2 limestone altars stood at the entrance to the inner room. The larger held frankincense, mixed with animal fat. The smaller held cannabis, mixed with animal dung, because dung burns hot enough to drive the compounds out of the plant, and charcoal alone does not. Tel Arad was not a temple in a city. It was a fortress on the southern frontier of the Kingdom of Judah, and the shrine stood inside the walls, in a garrison. So what was a psychoactive plant doing on the altar of an army post? So the record runs from the Altai to the Pamirs to the edge of the Negev, across societies with no contact and no shared language, inside the same few centuries. Nomads on the steppe, a man buried with a bow and a harp, and a border fort where soldiers were stationed and something psychoactive was burned on the altar. Here the limit has to be stated, because it decides what the evidence means. Every one of these contexts is funerary or cultic. Herodotus is describing a funeral. The braziers are grave goods. The altar is an altar. None of this sits on a battlefield. What it shows is narrower and stranger than a stimulant handed out before a charge. Across an enormous stretch of Iron Age Eurasia, warrior societies were burning one specific plant on hot stones in enclosed spaces, and they were doing it at the moments that carried the most weight, at death, and in the sanctuary of a fort on a contested border where men were waiting. The braziers survive with their stones still in them. The felt from Pazyryk survives, and so do the harps. What has not survived is one word from anybody who sat inside one of those tents about why they were in there. Number 5. Tobacco. In 2021, the archaeologist Darren Duke published a result in Nature Human Behavior from the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. His team had excavated a hearth left by hunter-gatherers camped on what was then wetland. Radiocarbon put the fire at about 12,300 years old. In the ash, among duck bones and stone tool debris, were 4 charred seeds of Nicotiana attenuata, wild tobacco. Nothing about that plant makes it food. It carries no meaningful calories. The leaves are bitter and toxic, and there is no sign the people at that fire were eating it. The find pushed human use of tobacco back by roughly 9,000 years, into the era of the first securely documented people in North America. Nicotine is not a mild drug. It binds to a receptor class distributed through the nervous system, at the junction between nerve and muscle, and deep inside the brain's reward circuitry. In small doses, it sharpens attention, steadies the hands, raises heart rate, and shuts down hunger. In larger doses, it is a poison, and in concentrated form, a very small quantity is lethal. It is also among the most reinforcing substance ever measured. The dependence builds faster and holds harder than almost anything else people take. And the species cultivated across eastern North America was not the one in cigarettes. It was Nicotiana rustica, which carries several times the nicotine of commercial tobacco. Smoked in the pipes, it was smoked in. It is a substantially stronger drug than anything sold in a shop today. The chemistry can be traced in the vessels as well as the hearths. In 2012, a team analyzing a small Maya flask from around AD 700 detected nicotine inside it. The flask's exterior carries a glyphic label identifying it as a container for tobacco. That is an unusually clean result in this field, because the writing on the outside and the residue on the inside agree. But here's where the archaeology and the ethnography lock together into something with a shape. Across enormous parts of North America, tobacco was the substance that made a decision binding. It was offered, shared, and smoked when agreements were made, when a council reached a conclusion, and when a war party was raised or dissolved. Different nations used it in different ways, and it is a mistake to flatten them together. But the pattern recurs too widely to be coincidence. This was not a recreational plant. It was the thing you burned when the stakes were highest, and going to war was the highest stake there was. So the sequence runs like this. A fire in Utah 12,000 years ago. A plant with no nutritional value in the ashes. Then pipes. Then labeled flasks. Then a continental system in which the strongest tobacco available was smoked at the moment men committed themselves to killing. The rest of the world got it in the 16th century and never gave it back. That is the recurring mechanism at the end of this entry, and it is the only drug on this list that has genuinely got worse. The receptor has not changed. The molecule has not changed. What changed is the delivery system, from a pipe passed around a council to a machine-rolled cylinder engineered to put nicotine into the brain in about 10 seconds, sold in the billions every day. Tobacco now kills more than 8 million people a year, and around 1 million of them never smoked. 12,000 years after 4 seeds fell into a hunter's fire in Utah, the plant is the largest preventable cause of death on the planet, and the smoke you can smell in a doorway on any street in the world is the same smoke. Number 4. Coca. In 2010, Tom Dillahay of Vanderbilt University published a paper in Antiquity with a set of dates that surprised even the people who work on Andean prehistory. His team had been excavating a cluster of small early sites in the Nanchoc Valley, in the foothills of northern Peru. On the floors of the house were coca leaves. Alongside them, pieces of calcite. Radiocarbon put the earliest of it around 8,000 years ago. The calcite is the half that matters. Coca leaf on its own surrenders very little of its alkaloid. Chewed together with an alkaline material, burnt lime or plant ash or powdered calcite, the chemistry shifts and the alkaloid crosses the lining of the mouth. The leaf is the drug. The lime is the technology that opens it. Finding the two together is what turns a scatter of plant fragments into evidence of a practice. And the Nanchoc sites showed something more organized than a habit. The calcite was being produced in small structures associated with processing it, which means somebody in that valley was extracting and supplying the alkaline half of the equation as a community undertaking at roughly the moment farming was taking hold in the region. 8,000 years ago, in the Andean foothills, coca chewing already had a supply chain. The pharmacology of the leaf is not the pharmacology of the powder, and the difference is the whole story. Coca leaf contains cocaine at well under 1% by weight, released slowly through the cheek over the better part of an hour. Isolate that alkaloid, as Albert Niemann did at Göttingen in 1860, and the same molecule arrives in a rush at a concentration the plant never delivers. Everything that separates a mild stimulant from one of the most destructive drugs in the world is dose and speed. What the leaf does is narrow and useful. It dulls hunger. It reduces the sensation of fatigue. It is used throughout the high Andes against the symptoms of altitude, though the research is honest that it changes how hard the work feels, more than it changes what the body can actually do. The Inca state took it seriously enough to control it. The chroniclers writing in the century after the conquest, Cieza de León, Polo de Ondegardo, Garcilaso de la Vega, Bernabe Cobo, all describe coca as a managed commodity, tied to the state and to ceremony. They say it was issued to the chasqui, the relay runners who carried messages at a sprint along the road system. They say it went with armies on campaign. These are colonial sources with their own interests, and they need reading carefully. On this point, they agree with each other, and with the coca bags found in the graves. Then, the Spanish arrived, and the story of coca stops being Andean. The early colonial church tried to suppress it as idolatry, and church councils issued condemnations. Then, silver was found at Potosi, and the administration discovered something that ended the argument. Workers supplied with coca would stay underground longer, on less food, at altitudes that break people. The condemnation quietly stopped. Coca became a taxed commodity. Plantations expanded to feed the mines, and the revenue from the leaf turned into one of the dependable income streams of the viceroyalty. A plant that had been chewed on house floors for 8,000 years became an instrument for extracting labor from the people who had domesticated it. The leaf never went away. It is still grown, still chewed, still brewed as tea across the Andes. It has also been listed as a controlled substance under an international convention since 1961. That is the haunting part of the arithmetic. A daily practice with 8,000 years behind it now sits on the wrong side of a line drawn in Geneva by people who had never been to the mountains. The calcite from Nanchok is still in the collections. Somebody burnt it, ground it, and handed it on. Their descendants are still doing it in the same valleys, with the same two ingredients, and the argument over whether they are permitted to is conducted in rooms none of them will ever enter. Number 3, the drug that erased the war. In the 4th book of the Odyssey, Telemachus arrives at Sparta looking for word of his father. Menelaus and Helen receive him. The talk turns to Troy and to the men who did not come home, and everyone in the room begins to weep. Helen puts a drug in the wine. Homer describes what it does with a precision that has unsettled readers for the better part of 3,000 years. It quiets all pain and anger, he says, and brings forgetfulness of every ill. A man who drank it would not shed a tear that day, not if his mother and father died in front of him, not if men cut down his brother or his son while he watched. Homer does not name it. The Greek word is an adjective, nepenthes, sorrow-banishing, attached to the ordinary noun for a drug. The name people now use for the substance was invented later by readers who wanted it to have one. He does say where it came from. Egypt, from a woman named Polydamna, and he adds that Egyptian soil grows more drugs than any other, and that every man there is a physician. So the oldest surviving description in European literature of a drug used to manage the aftermath of a war is set at a dinner table given by a host to veterans so that they can get through the evening. What it actually was is unresolved, and the leading answer has a problem. Opium is the popular candidate and has been argued in print, most influentially in a long study published in the Bulletin on Narcotics in 1967. The objection is straightforward. Opium does not do what the passage describes. It sedates, it slows, it puts people down. Helen's guests stay awake, conversational, and go on telling war stories for the rest of the night. Plutarch, reading the same lines 18 centuries ago, concluded the drug was a metaphor for Helen's skill at changing the subject. And then the chemistry caught up with the poppy, if not with the poem. In 2022, Vanessa Linares published organic residue analysis of vessels from late Bronze Age burials at Tel Yehud in central Israel. She worked with Ariola Jacoel and Ron Be'eri of the Israel Antiquities Authority, and with colleagues at Tel Aviv University and the Weizmann Institute. The burials date to the 14th century BC. 8 of the vessels carried opioid alkaloids and their decomposition products. Some were Cypriot imports, the base ring juglets whose upside-down shape has been argued since 1962 to imitate an incised poppy capsule. Others were plain local jars. The juglet as advertisement argument is still contested, and it should be. When Shlomo Bunimovitz and Zevi Letterman tested 17 of those juglets in 2016, they found perfumed oils and no opium whatsoever. What Tel Yehud establishes is narrower and much harder to dislodge. In the 14th century BC, in the Levant, opium was in circulation, and it was going into the ground with the dead. Morphine makes up something like a tenth of crude opium by weight. It works on receptors the body already uses for its own pain control, and what it does is not simply switch the pain off. It changes the person's relationship to it. The pain is still detectable. It just stops mattering. That is a very specific effect, and it is exactly the effect a wounded man needs. It is also the most disturbing thing about the drug, because the same property is what makes it impossible to put down, and at higher doses those receptors slow breathing until it stops. That is what actually kills people. Friedrich Sertiner isolated the compound in Paderborn between 1804 and 1806, tested it on himself, and named it for Morpheus. In 1853, Alexander Wood in Edinburgh and Charles Pervaz in France independently arrived at the hypodermic syringe. Within a generation, the strongest painkiller in the world could be put straight into the bloodstream of a man lying in a field, and armies noticed immediately. Which brings up a story worth correcting, because it gets told constantly. The claim is that the American Civil War produced a generation of morphine-addicted veterans, and that the condition had a name at the time: soldier's disease. The name is not attested during the war or in the decades after it. Its earliest appearance in print is in 1915 in the American Journal of Public Health, half a century late, and is army disease. Historians including David Courtwright have shown that opiate addiction in 19th century America was real and widespread, and that the largest addicted population was not veterans at all. It was middle-class women, being prescribed the drug by their doctors. The soldier's disease is mostly a retrofit, built backwards to explain a problem whose real shape was less convenient. What is not retrofitted is the continuity. Morphine is still on the battlefield. It is in the pack of every combat medic in every serious army on Earth, in a form built to be pushed through clothing into a thigh by someone with one hand free. 3,500 years after somebody set a juglet of opium into a grave outside what is now Tel Aviv, the same molecule from the same plant is carried into every war fought anywhere. It is carried by people whose entire job is to reach a wounded man before he understands what has happened to him. And it is in your hospital too. It is what they will give you if something goes badly wrong, for the same reason, out of the same flour. This is the oldest drug on this list that nobody ever improved on. We only learned to deliver it faster. Number 2, the men who could not be wounded. Around 1225, in Iceland, Snorri Sturluson wrote a history of the Norwegian kings, and in the 6th chapter of the first part of it, he described the followers of Odin. They went without armor. They were mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields. They were as strong as bears or bulls. They cut down men, and neither fire nor iron did them any harm. The word he uses for the state is berserkskanger, going berserk. That passage is the foundation of everything that has ever been claimed about berserkers. And the first thing that has to be said about it is when it was written. Snorri is composing 2 centuries after Iceland converted to Christianity, and 3 or 4 after the events he is narrating. He is a Christian aristocrat, writing a literary history of a pagan past he never saw. Berserkers turn up elsewhere in the same tradition. They appear in praise poems about Harold Fairhair's ships. in Egil's saga, and in dozens of later sagas where they exist mainly as stock villains for a hero to kill. Historians, including Roderick Dale, have argued at length that much of what we think we know is a literary type rather than a record of a practice. On that reading, the berserker of the earliest sources looks less like a drugged madman and more like an elite retainer, a specialist, a professional fighter in a lord's household. But there is one category of source that is not literary at all, and it changes the picture. The law codes. The Icelandic collection known as Gragas makes going berserk a punishable offense, and the Norwegian laws take the same line. Legal systems do not legislate against literary devices. That is an extraordinary detail to have survived. Whatever Berserksganger was, somebody in the 11th and 12th centuries thought it happened often enough and did enough damage to be worth a written penalty. So the behavior was real enough to be illegal, and the question of what caused it has been open ever since. The most famous answer was produced by a man who never left his study. In 1784, a Swedish theologian and naturalist named Samuel Odman published a short paper proposing that berserkers ate fly agaric. He had never seen a berserker, and he had never seen anyone take a mushroom. What he had were travelers' accounts of Siberian peoples using Amanita muscaria and a body of Norse literature describing men in an altered state. He put the two side by side and drew the line between them. A century later, the Norwegian botanist Frederick Christian Schubler took it up and expanded it. And from there, it moved into popular history and has never come out. What makes that theory so durable is not the evidence behind it. It is that it arrived first, and that for 200 years, nobody offered a competitor. The pharmacology, meanwhile, does not cooperate. The active compounds in fly agaric are ibotenic acid and muscimol. What they reliably produce is nausea, vomiting, dizziness, muscle twitching, sedation, a dreamlike dissociation, and very often sleep. It is a deliriant and a depressant. It is a poor description of a man who cannot be stopped, and an excellent description of a man who needs to lie down. In 2019, an ethnobotanist named Karsten Facher published an alternative in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, and his candidate does considerably better. Henbane. Hyoscyamus niger is a nightshade that grows across northern Europe, and it carries the same class of tropane alkaloids as mandrake. The effects are agitation, delirium, aggression, dilated pupils, flushed and burning skin, a rise in body temperature that makes clothing intolerable, real analgesia, and afterwards a long, flattening exhaustion. Fetcher lines those against saga, details the mushroom cannot cover, fighting without mail, failing to tell friend from enemy, and the collapse the texts insist comes after the fit. He is also explicit about what his theory does not explain, including the shield biting and the chattering teeth. And there is exactly one piece of physical evidence in this entire argument, and it comes out of a fortress. Firkat in Denmark is one of the ring fortresses built by Harold Bluetooth around 980. In one of its graves, a woman was buried inside the body of a wagon. She had silver toe rings, a box brooch from Gotland, bronze vessels of Eastern origin, and an iron staff with bronze fittings that has been read as a sorceress's staff. At her feet was a box holding owl pellets and small animal bones, and in a small pouch were hundreds of seeds of henbane. That is not a berserker taking a drug before a battle, and it should not be sold as one. It is evidence that henbane was known, valued, deliberately collected, and kept inside a royal military installation by somebody of very high status in the 10th century in Denmark. That is all it is. It is also more than any other candidate has ever produced. So where does that leave the most famous warriors in European folklore? With a legal category, a literary type, a pharmacology that fits, and a pouch of seeds in a woman's grave. There is no berserker burial with a chemical residue in it. No Norse text names a substance. Not one saga describes a berserker eating or drinking anything at all before the fit comes on. Every candidate ever proposed the mushroom, the henbane, the ale, the bog myrtle, has been reasoned backwards from the symptoms in a story to a plant that could produce them. That is not evidence. It is a shape being fitted to a hole. The shields survive, and the law codes survive, and the seeds survive in a museum drawer in Copenhagen. The men are gone, and so is whatever they did or did not swallow first. Number 1, the ration. In 2018, Li Lu of Stanford University published a study in the Journal of Archaeological Science. Reports on 3 stone mortars cut into the bedrock floor of Rockfet Cave on Mount Carmel in northern Israel. The cave is a Natufian burial ground, roughly 13,000 years old, where the dead were laid out on beds of flowering plants. Her team examined the residues trapped in the stone and found starch granules carrying the specific damage patterns that cereal grains acquire when they are sprouted, heated, and mashed. Their reading is beer, not agriculture, not bread, not yet. Fermentation, in a cave where people were burying their dead with flowers, thousands of years before anyone planted a field. The interpretation was challenged in print, and the team answered in print, and that argument continues. What is not in doubt is that grain was being processed inside that cave in a way that eating it does not require. At Göbekli Tepe, further north and several thousand years later, Oliver Dietrich and colleagues found limestone vats holding up to 160 liters, with chemical traces consistent with fermentation, standing at a monumental site with no houses. Alcohol is not one drug among the others on this list. It is the one that every complex society on Earth arrived at independently, in every climate where sugar and warmth exist together. And it went to armies before it went almost anywhere else. The oldest bureaucratic documents in the world include beer rations. Mesopotamian and Egyptian administrators measured it out by the jar, to laborers, to officials, and to soldiers. And the quantities are written down because somebody had to account for them. Roman soldiers had their sour wine. Norse warriors had ale and mead. And the drinking is not incidental in the sagas. It is where the boasts are made and the obligations are fixed. Tacitus, describing the Germans, says they deliberate at their feasts because they believe a man is least capable of concealment when he is drunk, and then decide the following day when they are sober. Later, Roman writers describe Gauls drinking undiluted wine, and those passages need handling with tongs, because a barbarian who cannot hold his drink is a stock character in Roman literature rather than an observation. The pharmacology is unglamorous and completely consistent. Alcohol is a depressant of the central nervous system, and the first things it depresses are the systems that produce caution. It reduces activity in the circuits that generate fear and threat response. It degrades the prefrontal machinery that weighs consequences. It narrows attention onto whatever is immediately in front of a person, so the cue in the room gets louder and the outcome tomorrow disappears. It raises the pain threshold. It also wrecks coordination, reaction time, and depth perception, all of which are the things that keep a man alive in a fight. So it does not make anybody a better soldier. It makes a man significantly more willing to be one, and measurably less able. So why has almost every army in recorded history made that trade on purpose? Because willingness was the harder problem. Skill can be drilled into a man over months. Getting him to walk toward people who are trying to kill him cannot. And alcohol was the only chemical answer available for most of human history. The truly disturbing thing about alcohol on this list is not that it is the oldest entry. It is that it is the only one that never stopped. Every other drug here has to be dug out of the ground, or inferred from a residue, or argued about for 200 years. This one was distributed by governments in a measured quantity, from a barrel, on a schedule, to men who were expected to fight. British soldiers in the trenches of the First World War were issued rum from stoneware jars, and it was frequently issued immediately before an attack, which everybody involved understood perfectly well. In the Royal Navy, the practice was formalized down to the fraction. An eighth of a pint of rum at over 50% alcohol every day at noon, for every rating who wanted it. That was not a medieval survival. It ran until the 31st of July, 1970. On that morning, the last tot was poured across the fleet. Sailors wore black armbands. Some of them held mock funerals for the barrel and threw it over the side. They called it Black Tot Day. And men who were there are in their 70s and 80s now and will tell you about it in detail. Think about what that date actually means. The Apollo program had already landed on the moon. There were nuclear submarines at sea, and the Royal Navy was still handing out a daily measure of spirits to the crews of warships in a direct, unbroken institutional line running back through the sailing fleet, through the Roman ration, through the Sumerian clerk writing down jars of beer for soldiers, to a stone mortar in a burial cave on Mount Carmel 13,000 years ago. Every exotic candidate on this list is contested. The mushroom is contested. The soma plant is contested. The Scythian tent is real, and the battlefield connection is not. Almost everything we would like to know about what ancient warriors took before a fight is inference, argument, and a residue on the inside of a broken pot. And underneath all of it, the whole time, unglamorous and undisputed and impossible to dig up because it never went into the ground, is the one substance we can actually prove they were given. It is in the ration lists. It is in the histories. It is in the law codes and the poems and the accounts of the quartermasters. It was in the hands of the men going over the parapet in 1916, and it was on the deck of a British warship in 1970. The mortars are still cut into the floor of that cave, with the burials beside them. The last barrel went into the sea more than 50 years ago. 13,000 years separate the two, and the drug in both of them is the same, and nobody has ever needed to argue about what it was. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.